There have been a ton of incredible moments and incredible storylines for the 2022 college football season so far, but after only 3 weeks, we are now down to 32 undefeated teams. That number is likely going to drop by a lot after week 4. In today's video, I thought it'd be fun to rank all 32 undefeated teams, go through their seasons so far, and put them in their place. I want to clarify this has nothing to do with the top 25 and just my personal rankings throughout the first 3 weeks, and I'm more so looking at this as a power ranking. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So at number 32, we're going to talk about James Madison. This is their first year in the FBS as they have joined the Sun Belt Conference, and so far they are 2-0 with wins over Middle Tennessee and Norfolk State. That is by far the worst 2 wins of any undefeated team, so we have them at number 32. At number 31, I have Coastal Carolina. Just like the Dukes of James Madison, the Chanticleers are in the Sun Belt Conference, and so far they have won 3 games. Granted, they have not looked very good in the process, but they have beat Army, Gardner-Webb, and Buffalo, which gives them 3 wins, and they have an opportunity for good games against Marshall, App State, and Virginia later in the year. Let's see how it goes for them. At number 30, we have Iowa State. This is the first Power 5 team on the list, and while I actually really like the Cyclones, they haven't really done anything. They beat an FCS school in southeastern Missouri State, they beat a bad Ohio team, and then they barely survived against Iowa. Yes, Iowa has a good offense, and they never seem to win the Cy-Hawk Trophy, but they weren't very impressive in that game against Iowa, and we're going to find out a lot more against Baylor. After that, we have the UCLA Bruins. Just like Iowa State, UCLA hasn't really done anything. They beat Bowling Green, Alabama State, and South Alabama, and in that South Alabama game, they barely won as they edged the Jaguars 32-31. They play Colorado next week before a big game against Washington, so let's see if the Bruins can live up to their offseason hype or if they will fall apart. Next up, we have Rutgers. Some can argue they deserve to be higher on the list, but in my opinion, they have not been very impressive. They went on the road and beat Boston College, where they won by 1 point, then came home against Wagner, and then barely went on the road and beat Temple. Temple is in a bad spot, and they should have done a lot better against them. And just like a lot of teams, we're going to see if they can climb to 4-0 as they will play home against Iowa this upcoming weekend. This is a great start for Greg Schiano, but I'm going to need to see more out of Rutgers if I want to rank them higher. We now go to our second team from the Big 12 in TCU. The first game came on the road against Colorado, which is probably the worst Power 5 school in the country right now, and while they are bad, they did go on the road and beat another Power 5 team, and then they beat Tarleton State at home. Neither of these wins are very impressive, and they've only won 2 games, so I can't be very high on the Horned Frogs right now. We will find out a lot in the next month as they play at SMU, then Oklahoma, at Kansas, and home against Oklahoma State. We now go over to the ACC and talk about one of the great Cinderella stories of the season and the Duke Blue Devils. In week 1, they shut out Temple 30-0 before going on the road and beating Northwestern 31-23. While there was a little bit of luck involved in that win, a win against a Power 5 team is a win, and for Duke, that's a huge deal. After a win over NC A&T, they have now climbed up to 3-0, where they have an odd, huge game on the road against Kansas this week. This will be a battle of 2 perennial basketball powerhouses, and we'll see who can get to 4-0. We now go back to the Big Ten, where we talk about Minnesota. Minnesota has been known for scheduling an easy non-conference over the last few years, and that was no different this season. In Jerry Kill's return to Minnesota, they killed New Mexico State, then they destroyed Western Illinois in week 2, before they beat Colorado in week 3. None of those 3 wins are impressive, and with Colorado being the worst Power 5 team right now, it doesn't count for much. The Gophers also lost their star receiver for the season, and we're going to find out what they're made of as they play at Michigan State this weekend. Let's see what happens. We now go to our highest ranked Group of 5 team, and that is Tulane. While wins against UMass and Alcorn State don't mean much, they got a huge one this past weekend. They went on the road to Manhattan, Kansas, and upset the Kansas State Wildcats 17-10. For a Tulane program which has not done much historically, this was a huge win for them, and they now have a lot of momentum going into the remainder of their season, and we're going to find out a lot in 2 weeks when they go on the road to play Houston. After that, we go back to the Big Ten, and we're going to talk about the Maryland Terrapins. So far, Maryland hasn't really done a whole lot this season. They beat Buffalo in week 1, beat Charlotte in week 2, and then had a slightly impressive win against SMU in week 3. SMU is one of the better teams in the American, and it is a step in the right direction that they didn't lose one of those 3 games, but I'm not very high on the Terps right now, and we're going to see if they can keep their 4-0 record with a game against Michigan this Saturday. After that, we have the Oregon State Beavers. I'm a huge fan and very high on the Beavers, and I'm very impressed with what Coach Jonathan Smith has done there. In week 1, they beat Boise State, and while that win isn't as big as it used to be, it's still impressive for them, and then after that, they survived against Fresno State in week 2. The Bulldogs are one of the better group of 5 teams, and they had a very exciting play in which they score but no time left. This past weekend they beat Montana State, and now they get to host USC at home this weekend. It's an absolute crime that game is on Pac-12 Network, but Oregon State can really put the program's name on the map if they can somehow beat the top 10 ranked Trojans. Let's see what happens. Up next, we have another team that historically has been terrible in the Indiana Hoosiers. It's been an interesting season for them. After going 2-10 last year, they had a late comeback to beat Illinois, survived a scare against Idaho, and then this past weekend found a way to come back against Western Kentucky, force overtime, and win there. While it has not been the prettiest performance by the Hoosiers so far, they have beaten 2 decent teams, and with a trip to Cincinnati this weekend, we're going to find out a lot and see if they can stay unbeaten. After that, we have Oklahoma. In Game 1 of the Brent Venables era, they beat UTEP, and then in Week 2, they beat Kent State. Neither of those games were competitive, and it showed us nothing. Usually a win on the road against Nebraska would mean something, but with how bad of a spot the Huskers program is currently in, and how defeated Nebraska looked, I take this past weekend's performance with a grain of salt. I think Oklahoma will end up being a 10-plus win team, but I don't think they're really going to be tested until they play Texas in 3 weeks. We go down to the SEC for our next team and talk about Ole Miss. Currently, they're ranked number 16 in the country, and while some may think I'm hating on them right now, they haven't really done anything. They beat Troy in Week 1, Central Arkansas in Week 2, and then shut out Georgia Tech in Week 3. The only thing keeping Georgia Tech from being the worst Power 5 program is Colorado. Georgia Tech is definitely a close second, and Jeff Collins has run the Yellow Jackets program into the ground. They are non-competitive and just absolutely terrible in all departments, so the only impressive thing about that game was the fact they shut them out. Ole Miss has a game against Tulsa before a huge matchup against Kentucky in Week 5. We're not going to find out a lot until then. Some may find this controversial, but honestly Michigan might deserve to be lower on the list. They've played 3 of the worst teams in college football, as they killed Colorado State in Week 1, killed Hawaii in Week 2, and then recently shut out UConn in Week 3. All 3 of those teams are probably in the bottom 10 in college football right now, so we have learned absolutely nothing about Michigan. This weekend they play an undefeated Maryland team before they get a test against Iowa in Week 5. Let's see what happens. Oklahoma State is the next team on our list, and they're another top 10 team that I'm not super high on yet. They beat Central Michigan in Week 1 and Arkansas Pine Bluff in Week 3. While on paper a win over Arizona State looks good, it really doesn't hold a lot of weight. Arizona State just lost to Eastern Michigan this past weekend. They fired Herm Edwards, and they're probably the second worst team in the Pac-12 outside of Colorado. It's been a decent start for Oklahoma State. We are going to find out what they are made of in conference play. NC State was supposed to be the Cinderella team of the ACC, and while that dream is not dead yet, they haven't impressed me that much. They survived a trap game on the road against East Carolina in Week 1, in which the Pirates missed an extra point in a game-winning field goal, and if it weren't for that, they would have lost. They beat Charleston Southern in Week 2, before they had an impressive win over an undefeated Texas Tech team in Week 3. They have a tune-up game against UConn before they go on the road against Clemson, and that will be the first challenge to their undefeated name. Washington has been quite a surprise in college football this year. I've always been high on Kalen DeBoer, but I did not expect Michael Penix to be this good. After being at Indiana for 4 years, Penix transferred to Washington to save his career. He earned the starting job and has led them to wins over Kent State, Portland State, and then this past weekend, a win over number 11 Michigan State. While I do think Michigan State is a tad bit overrated, they beat a good ranked Big Ten team at home, and that offense looks unstoppable right now. Looking ahead, their schedule is not that difficult, and there is a real chance, in my opinion, that Washington could win the Pac-12 North. The Oregon game will probably decide that, but for now, good for Washington. The Clemson Tigers are currently ranked number 5 in the country, but besides their name, they haven't done anything to earn that spot. They beat a bad Georgia Tech team in Week 1 before they beat Furman Louisiana Tech. Those 3 games did not really show us anything, and at minimum, they struggled against Georgia Tech in the first half, and there was a lot of criticism for that. DJ Uiagalelei has done enough for now, but with games against Wake Forest, NC State, Florida State, and Syracuse coming up, he's going to have to play a lot better if Clemson wants to win those games and keep their prestige alive. Speaking of Wake Forest, it's been an interesting season for them. They were without Sam Hartman for the first game, but they still went on to easily beat VMI. In Week 2, they went to Vanderbilt, who obviously is not in a great spot, and they won that game 45-25. You have to give credit to a team for going on the road and beating another Power 5 team, but I'm just not that impressed with them, and this past weekend, they survived against Liberty. Liberty scored a late touchdown and decided to go for 2, and had they gotten that 2-point conversion, the narrative around Wake Forest would be a lot different. The Demon Deacons have one of the biggest games in years as they host number 5 Clemson this weekend, and we will see if they'll stay undefeated or if they'll be exposed. Everyone knew USC was going to have a ton of hype with Lincoln Riley, Caleb Williams, and Jordan Addison, and so far they've done exactly what is expected of them. They beat Rice in week 1, survived a test against Stanford on the road in week 2, and then killed Fresno State in week 3. They dominated all 3 of those games from start to finish, and so far the USC offense looks good. In my opinion, this Oregon State game will actually be a test for the Trojans, and they also have games against Washington State and Utah coming up, and while they'll more than likely win all 3 of them, I'm very curious to see how this USC team will play when they are actually tested. North Carolina's had a very interesting start to the season. After beating Florida A&M in week 0, they survived one of the most thrilling games in a long time against App State. They completely blew the game, but they were lucky enough to stop 2 2-point conversions, and they beat the Mountaineers 63-61. After that, they went on the road to play Georgia State, where they won 35-28. 2 one-possession wins on the road against a group of 5 teams aren't great, but the fact that they did win them says a lot about this team, and Drake May is playing really well right now, and we'll see if they can beat Notre Dame at home this weekend. Right now, North Carolina looks like a pretender, but they could be a contender with a win this weekend. Everyone expected Kentucky to be good this season, and they have lived up to the hype. Led by Will Levis, they beat Miami of Ohio 37-13 in week 1, before they had a huge win against number 12 Florida in week 2. They controlled the line of scrimmage, Will Levis outplayed Anthony Richardson, and they obviously scored more points than the Gators. So from start to finish, Kentucky was the better team, and that is a huge win for them. After that, they climbed into the top 10, where they shut out Youngstown State this past weekend. This weekend, they get Northern Illinois, before they have a huge matchup with Ole Miss on the road. That game could go either way, and we'll find out a lot about Kentucky's SEC title hopes in that matchup. Another great surprise from the 2022 season has been Syracuse. Many will probably say I'm way too high on them right now, but the way this team has played has me sold on them. Louisville had a ton of hype going into this year, but Syracuse shut that down immediately and won 31-7. In week 2, they went on the road and survived a trap game against UConn before they beat a good Purdue team this weekend. While Purdue basically gifted them the game, this Syracuse offense finally has a good running back, quarterback, and receiver, and Coach Dino Babers seems to be back to his 2018 form. The Orange are 3-0 right now, and with games against Virginia and Wagner coming up, they shouldn't be tested until they play NC State in week 6. Right now, I am believing in the Orange, and they have impressed me so far. Now we get to the team everyone loves, and that is Kansas. Lance Leipold has the Jayhawks program headed in a new direction, and they have 2 really impressive wins. After beating Tennessee Tech in week 1, they went on the road to West Virginia and won that game in overtime. They were the better team there, and it wasn't a fluke, as they then went to Houston and won 48-30. They dominated the Cougars from start to finish, and everyone forgets that Houston is the team picked to win the American. Right now, Kansas has the most efficient quarterback in college football in Jalen Daniels. The players have bought into the culture, and they are undefeated. This weekend's matchup against Duke is huge, and America is rooting for the Jayhawks. I might be a little bit higher on Washington State than some, but so far they have impressed me. Besides a fluke game against Idaho in week 1, they dominated Wisconsin from start to finish in week 2, and I cannot remember the last time a team went into Camp Randall and beat them. Cameron Ward has lived up to his hype, and after this past weekend's victory over Colorado State, the Cougars are now 3-0. They have a huge matchup this weekend against Oregon, and there are Pac-12 North title stakes on the line. So far, Washington State is one of the most under-the-radar teams in college football, and they have one of the more impressive wins as well. Let's see how they finish out. Tennessee is a team that I've been high on for quite a while now, and Coach Heupel and quarterback Hendon Hooker have done a great job. They killed Ball State in week 1 before they went on the road and beat Pitt 34-27. That was a very impressive win for the Volunteers, and after killing Akron this past weekend, they are now undefeated, ranked number 11 in the country, and have a matchup with number 20 Florida. Florida has given them fits in the past, so we'll see if they can win this game, but if so, Tennessee may have a chance at the East. We now get to our final 6 schools, and the first one is Ohio State. Ohio State has one of the best wins of any team right now, as they beat Notre Dame at home. While the win over Notre Dame now doesn't look as impressive, it was huge for week 1. Not many teams can say they have a top 5 victory right now, and despite having injury issues, Ohio State's offense has looked terrific, the defense has bounced back, and the Buckeyes have a ton of talent all around the field. After wins over Arkansas State and Toledo, they now have a home night game against Wisconsin, and they will more than likely win that game. Props to Ohio State. At number 5, I have Florida State. While some people will say I'm way too high on the Seminoles, they have impressed me so far. After beating Duquesne in week 0, they went on the road and beat LSU. While it's technically a neutral site game, it was played in New Orleans, so I call this a home game for LSU. They squandered a bit down the stretch, but Florida State finally found a way to beat a good team, and that was the biggest win of the Norvell era. How did they follow that up? Well, they went on the road and beat Louisville. Louisville may not be the best team in the world, but after losing their starting quarterback Jordan Travis, Tate Rodemaker came in, and Johnny Wilson had the game of his life, and they beat the Cardinals on the road 35-31, and they have now beat 2 Power 5 teams on the road, are undefeated, and are starting to get back to their old form. Penn State is a team that has shocked me this year. I have never been a believer in Sean Clifford, but so far, he's done well. In week 1, they played against Purdue, and the Boilermakers were picked to finish second in the West, so this was a very impressive victory. Clifford had 5 touchdowns, and in a gutsy performance, they won 35-31. After that, they went home and dominated Ohio before beating Auburn on the road. Anytime you go into an SEC stadium and beat up on an SEC team, you're going to get credit for that. They won 41-12, and that game was never close. Penn State has games against Central Michigan and Northwestern coming up, and they should be 5-0 going into a huge matchup on the road against Michigan. Penn State has impressed me this year, and James Franklin is saving his job. At number 3, I have Arkansas. Yes, I know, they struggled against Missouri State, but they found a way to win that game pretty easily at the end. The Razorbacks have been one of the more impressive teams in college football. In week 1, they beat number 23 Cincinnati, and week 2, they beat South Carolina. They've won all 3 of these games by double digits. KJ Jefferson has been great, Rocket Sanders has been one of the best running backs in the country, and Coach Sam Pittman has Arkansas in a great spot. If they can find a way to survive against A&M this weekend, they'll have a home game against Alabama, which will be a top 10 showdown. Speaking of Alabama, I will put them at number 2. 1, because I don't want to get a million hate comments, but 2, because they went and had a very impressive win against Texas. They dominated Utah State 55-0, killed UL Monroe 63-7, and then obviously beat Texas, and that was a huge moment for Bryce Young, and despite all the mess-ups, they still found a way to win. Alabama is 3-0, and they have a home game against Vanderbilt this weekend. As I said just a couple seconds ago, they have a road game against Arkansas in week 5, and in my opinion, that might be their toughest test of the season. Let's see what happens. At number 1, we have Georgia. Everyone was saying that Georgia was going to fall off after winning the title last year, but that has not been the case. In week 1, they killed Oregon 49-3, and after Oregon just beat BYU, that win looks a lot more impressive. In week 2, they shut out Samford 33-0, and then this past weekend, they went on the road to South Carolina and won 48-7, and it should have been 48-0. They made Oregon and South Carolina look hopeless. The defense might even be better than last year, and Georgia is on track to winning another national championship if they keep this level of play up. So yeah, in today's video, we talked about all 32 undefeated teams. We ranked them 1 through 32, and I gave my thoughts on it. But what do you think? If you're a fan of one of these 32 schools, how do you think your team will finish? What topic could I take a look at in my next video? And let me know your thoughts down below. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel, leave a like if you want to support the channel, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.